Caliban and the Witch, Section, Urban Struggles. Not only women and men, but peasants and urban workers found in the heretic movement a common cause. This commonality of interests among people who could otherwise be assumed to have different concerns and aspirations can be accounted for on several grounds. First, in the Middle Ages, a tight relation existed between city and country. Many burghers were ex-serfs who had moved or fled to the city in the hope of a better life, and, while exercising their arts, continued to work the land, particularly at harvest time. Their thoughts and desires were still profoundly shaped by life in the village and by their continuing relationship to the land. Peasants and urban workers were also brought together by the fact that they were subjected to the same political rulers, since by the 13th century, especially in northern and central Italy, the landed nobility and the urban patrician merchants were becoming assimilated, functioning as one power structure. This situation promoted among workers mutual concerns and solidarity. Thus, whenever the peasants rebelled, they found beside themselves the artisans and day laborers, as well as the growing mass of the urban poor. This was the case during the peasant revolt in maritime Flanders, which began in 1323 and ended in June 1328, after the King of France and the Flemish nobility defeated the rebels at Cassel in 1327. As David Nicholas writes, quote, "The rebels' ability to continue the conflict for 5 years is conceivable only in light of the city's involvement." End quote. He adds that, by the end of 1324, the peasants in revolt had been joined by the craftsmen at Ypres and Bruges. Beginning of long quote. Bruges, by now under the control of a weaver and fuller party, took direction of the revolt from the peasants. A war of propaganda began, as monks and preachers told the masses that a new era had come, and that they were the equals of the aristocrats. End quote. Another peasant-urban worker alliance was that of the Teuchins, a movement of, quote, bandits, operating in the mountains of central France, in which artisans joined an organization that was typical of the rural populations. What unified peasants and artisans was a common aspiration to the leveling of differences. As Norman Cohn writes, this is evidenced in documents of various kinds. Beginning of long quote. From the proverbs of the poor that lament that, quote, "The poor man works always, worries and labors and weeps, never laughing from his heart, while the rich man laughs and sings." End quote. From the miracle plays, where it is stated that, quote, "Each man ought to have as much property as every other, and we have nothing we can call our own. The great lords have all the property, and poor folk have nothing but suffering and adversity." End quote. From the most widely read satires which denounce that, quote, "Magistrates, provosts, beadles, mayors, nearly all live by robbery. They all batten on the poor. They all want to despoil them. The strong robs the weaker." End quote. Or again, quote, "Good working men make wheaten bread, but they will never chew it. No. All they get is the siftings from the corn, and from good wine they get nothing but the dregs, and from good cloth nothing but the chaff. Everything that is tasty and good goes to the nobles and the clergy." End of long quote. These complaints show how deep was the popular resentment against the inequalities that existed between the big birds and the small birds, the fat people and the lean people, as rich and poor were referred to in the Florentine political idiom of the 14th century. Quote, "Nothing will be well in England until we are all of the same condition," John Ball proclaimed during his drive to organize the 1381 English peasant rising. As we have seen, the main expressions of this aspiration to a more egalitarian society were the exaltation of poverty and the communism of goods. But the affirmation of an egalitarian perspective was also reflected in a new attitude towards work, most evident among the heretic sects. On one side, we have a, quote, "refusal of work" strategy, such as that adopted by the French Waldenses, the poor of Lyon, and the members of some conventual orders, Franciscans, spirituals, who, wishing to be free from mundane cares, relied on begging and community support for their survival. On the other hand, we have a new valorization of work, particularly manual labor, that achieved its most conscious formulations in the propaganda of the English lollards, who reminded their followers that, quote, "The nobles have beautiful houses. We have only work and hardships. But it is from our work that everything comes." End quote. Undoubtedly, the appeal to the, quote, "value of work," a novelty in a society dominated by a military class, functioned primarily as a reminder of the arbitrariness of feudal power. But this new awareness also demonstrates the emergence of new social forces that played a crucial role in the downfall of the feudal system. This valorization of work reflects the formation of an urban proletariat, made up in part of journeymen and apprentices, working under artisan masters, producing for the local market, but mostly by waged day laborers, employed by rich merchants in industries producing for export. By the turn of the 14th century, in Florence, Siena, and Flanders, concentrations of up to 4,000 of such day laborers, weavers, fullers, dyers, could be found in the textile industry. For them, life in the city was just a new type of serfdom, this time under the rule of the cloth merchants, who exercised the strictest control over their activities and the most despotic class rule. Urban wage workers could not form any associations, and were even forbidden to meet in any place and for any reason. They could not carry arms, or even the tools of their trade, and they could not strike on pain of death. In Florence, they had no civil rights, unlike the journeymen. They were not part of any craft or guild, and they were exposed to the cruelest abuses at the hands of the merchants, who, in addition to controlling the town government, ran their private tribunal, and, with impunity, spied on them, arrested them, tortured them, and hanged them at the least sign of trouble. It is among these workers that we find the most extreme forms of social protest and the greatest acceptance of heretic ideas. Throughout the 14th century, particularly in the Flanders, cloth workers were engaged in constant rebellions against the bishop, the nobility, the merchants, and even the major crafts. At Bruges, when the main crafts gained power in 1348, wool workers continued to rebel against them. At Ghent, in 1335, a revolt by the local bourgeoisie was overtaken by a rebellion of weavers, who tried to establish a, quote, workers' democracy, based on the suppression of all authorities, except those living by manual labor. Defeated by an impressive coalition of forces, including the prince, the nobility, the clergy, the bourgeoisie, the weavers tried again in 1378, when they succeeded in establishing what, with some exaggeration perhaps, has been called the, quote, first dictatorship of the proletariat known in history. Their goal, according to Peter Bossonade, was, quote, to raise journeymen against masters, wage earners against great entrepreneurs, peasants against lords and clergy. It was said that they had contemplated the extermination of the whole bourgeois class, with the exception of children of 6, and the same for the nobles. End quote. They were defeated only by a battle in the open field at Rysbeck in 1382, where 26,000 of them lost their lives. The events at Bruges and Ghent were not isolated cases. In Germany and Italy as well, the artisans and laborers rebelled at every possible occasion, forcing the local bourgeoisie to live in a constant state of fear. In Florence, the workers seized power in 1379, led by the Chiompi, the day laborers in the Florentine textile industry. Footnote: the Chiompi were those who washed, combed, and greased the wool so that it could be worked. They were considered unskilled workers and had the lowest social status. Quote, Chiompo is a derogatory term, meaning dirty and poorly dressed, probably due to the fact that the Chiompi worked half naked and were always greasy and stained with dyes. Their revolt began in July 1382, sparked by the news that one of them, Simoncino, had been arrested and tortured. Apparently, under torture, he had been made to reveal that the Chianti had held a secret meeting during which, kissing each other on the mouth, they had promised to defend each other from the abuses of their employers. Upon hearing of Simoncino's arrest, workers rushed to the guild hall of the wool industry, Palazzo dell'Arte, demanding that their comrade be released. Then, after securing his release, they occupied the guild hall, put patrols on Ponte Vecchio, and hung the insignia of the, quote, minor guilds, art miliori, from the windows of the guild hall. They also occupied the city hall, where they claimed to have found a room full of nooses, which, they believed, were meant for them. Seemingly in control of the situation, the Chianti presented a petition demanding that they become part of the government, that they no longer be punished by cutting of a hand for non-payment of debts, that the rich pay more taxes, and that corporal punishment be replaced by monetary fines. In the first week of August, they formed a militia and set up 3 new crafts, while preparations were made for an election in which, for the first time, members of the Chianti would participate. Their new power, however, lasted no more than a month, as the wool magnates organized a lockout that reduced them to hunger. After their defeat, many were arrested, hung, and decapitated. Many more had to leave the city in an exodus that marked the beginning of the decline of the wool industry in Florence. End of footnote. They too established a workers' government, but it only lasted a few months before being completely defeated by 1382. The workers at Liege, in the Low Countries, were more successful. In 1384, the nobility and the rich, the great as they were called, incapable of continuing a resistance which had lasted for more than a century, capitulated. From then on, quote, the crafts completely dominated the town, becoming the arbiter of the municipal government. The craftsmen had also given support to the peasants in revolt, in maritime Flanders, in a struggle that lasted from 1323 to 1328, which Pirenne describes as, quote, a genuine attempt at a social revolution. Here, according to a Flemish contemporary whose allegiance is apparent, quote, the plague of insurrection was such that men became disgusted with life. End quote. Thus, from 1320 to 32, the, quote, good people of Ypres implored the king not to allow the town's inner bastions, within which they lived, to be demolished, because they protected them from the, quote, common people. Picture: Jacquerie. Peasants took arms in Flanders in 1323, France in 1358, in England in 1381, in Florence, Ghent, and Paris in 1370 and 1380. End of section.